the British public, the voters' central dominant belief is a passionate belief that they can have their cake and eat it. And this is found across the ideological spectrum.
Britain is basically a health service with a TV station attached.
If instead productivity grows at the current rate, which is about 0.5% a year over that period, debt will explode to 649% of GDP.
Do we live in a zombie economy?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today we're going to talk about government and economic growth in the 21st century. That is also the title of a book edited by Juan Castaneda, who is at the Winston Center, Buckingham University. He was originally supposed to be on the panel as well, but he couldn't make it, unfortunately, for personal reasons. Okay, so the title, when I saw this, I thought, well, there was a time when we wouldn't have had an event with a title like that, because we would have said, well, isn't everything we do sort of about economic growth, or at least economic prosperity, whether it's explicit or implicit, whether it's specific sectors or the economy as a whole? Britain today is not noticeably richer than it was in 2007. And that's very unusual in a market economy. That's really not supposed to happen. So pretty much since the early days of the Industrial Revolution, it was a fairly reasonable expectation that every generation would be somewhat better off than the previous one. But now we have the situation where if you are a late millennial or an early member of Generation Z, that means, so let's say you entered the labor market in or after 2008, you've never had the experience of living in a growing economy. You've never had the experience of living in an economy where you think, we're getting somewhere, something is happening, and it may not all be brilliant, but surely we're going in the right direction. Surely we should at least be careful about not damaging the progress that does happen. Well, that is clearly not the situation today. It hasn't been the situation for quite some time. And the problem with that is, well, manyfold. So I remember a little about 12 or 13 years ago that there was a movement comparable to the degrowth movement that we have today. It was called the movement for a steady state economy, stationary economy, where, okay, you could say these people pretty much got their way accidentally. So the fact that there hasn't been economic growth is posing distributional conflicts, it's poisoning political discourse, it has all sorts of implications. And so that's why, short summary is that there is a reason why we have to single out, we have to talk about economic growth even at this abstract level. And I'm delighted to be joined today by, well, I don't need to read this out, we all know each other. Well, this is all IEA veterans. Steve Davies, of course, is our education fellow, Julian Jessop, our economics fellow, and Cento Veljanovski, indirect predecessor of mine, used to be. It was called something else. It was research director at the time.
Research
director. Research. Okay, well, it was a bit grander than mine. I have to. But I hope it. Okay. It's also manager fellow at Case Associates, and the format fairly simple. They're all going to have 5 to 10 minutes to tell us about their take on this matter, and maybe some questions will arise for me. If not, I'll open straight to the floor. Let's just go through in this order. Steve, let's start with you then.
Right, thanks, Kristian. Well, I think it's fair. I think what Kristian said is completely correct, those remarks you heard at the start. And the first point I'd make is that the concern with economic growth as the central subject of politics, regardless of which part of the political spectrum people come from, is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. You only find it from the 1950s onwards. And the very concept of economic growth, as opposed to the reality, isn't really formulated until the 1920s by people like Irving Fisher and Simon Kuznets. Before then, it began to dawn on economists in the 1880s that there had been economic growth, but the concept wasn't theorized, partly because before Simon Kuznets, there was no agreed yardstick or way of measuring it. The classical economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, most of them, in fact, I took the view that Kristian just described. They thought that we were going to eventually reach a stationary state, as they called it, where things would just tick over and there wouldn't be any general increase in prosperity. So why are people so concerned with economic growth now? Well, the reason is partly because our politics has entirely become driven by it. So politicians run on the promise that they will take the proceeds of economic growth and give goodies to the people they want to vote for them. And they also know, they're smart enough to know that if you live in a world of zero growth, then politics becomes a zero-sum game, and it becomes a lot more difficult and unpleasant. Because if you're in a zero-sum game, no economic growth, you can't make one group of people better off without making somebody else worse off. Now, at the moment, it's quite clear that the British public, the voters' central dominant belief is a passionate belief that they can have their cake and eat it. And this is found across the ideological spectrum. You find it from right to left, all the points in between. So on the left, there's the idea that you can have high levels of government spending, but ordinary people on average or median incomes are not going to have to pay for this, because all that spending is going to be paid for by taxing the rich, apparently. Clearly, which thought will tell you this simply isn't true. On the right, on the other hand, the free market right, there is the belief that you can have big reductions in taxation, but without attacking any of the major items of government spending. So, no reductions in particularly spending that benefits the elderly. Apparently, this is because tax cuts are meant to be self-funding, which again is another thing that doesn't stand up to any kind of analysis. Then on the other hand, on the nationalist right, you have people who think that you can suddenly completely stop immigration, or even, according to the wilder spirits in that part of the spectrum, deport several million people because they don't have the right genes, apparently. And this can happen without any kind of economic impact or effects. You can remove several million people from the labour market and somehow they'll just be automatically replaced by people who are currently not economically active. Now, what this means, I think, is that if you're in a think tank like we are here, or indeed in a political party, although it's more difficult, you have to avoid the perils of cakeism at almost any cost. What you have to do if you are advocating, for example, reductions in taxation, is to say, well, this means we are going to have to reduce this or that area of government spending. It means confronting tough questions. Above all, for all developed nations, and not just Britain, it means confronting the very tough question of what to do about the elderly, because the way things are going, in another few years, according to recent reports, we are going to have to spend something like 60 to 70% of GDP simply to meet the demands of pensions, healthcare going mainly to the elderly, and keep the rest of the welfare state the way it is. The alternative is to have a state which basically, as Paul Krugman has said about the American government, is an old age pension and health treatment company that happens to have a military, which is a pretty accurate description of the American federal government, by the way. So we're in a position where I think brutal truth is something that needs to be put to the voters and put forward. We need to reread Bill Hutt's famous little book about politically impossible, where he was saying, forget about people telling you this is politically impossible. Just say what you think the economics leads you to conclude. And this, as I say, is something that applies across the spectrum. But my other point is that actually the point Kristian made, that there's been no real economic growth since the financial crisis, this is a point you could make about pretty much any developed country with the possible exception of the United States. I do think myself that actually we didn't suffer such a severe inflection. One of my increasingly strong opinions is that actually a lot of the growth we had before 2008 was illusory. And to the extent that it was real, it was concentrated almost totally in one sector and one region of the country. And that concealed what otherwise was a very bad performance. And I think we need to confront a number of very difficult situations and think in a slightly different way to the way we've done before. One of them is that the reason why the Thatcher Revolution happened was because the British economy was underperforming relative to its competitors, Germany, the European continent, the United States, Japan. And the idea was that by reforming things like the trade unions, the labour market, getting rid of the kind of enormous feather bedding in the manufacturing, you would make the British economy more dynamic. And it looked for quite a long time, till the early 90s actually, or even the mid-90s, as though this has happened. But then basically the impetus that free market revolution gave faded away, and the rate of growth in the British economy up until 2008 went back to the rather low level that it had been at before Thatcher. And we have to, I think about why did that happen. Since 2008, there's been nothing. And I think that for structural reasons, as well as political reasons, it's going to be very, very difficult to get economic growth going. Now, what that means, I think, is that we have to try and get it. We should look at everything we can do to revive economic growth for very good and strong reasons that Kristian hinted at or alluded to. But I think we have to we have to be pessimistic. Somebody said it's always good to be a pessimist because you're constantly being pleasantly surprised. You're never disappointed. And I think that's how we should be increasingly going forward about economic growth. We should try for it, but we should expect that many of the things we try to do are not going to work or will have more obstacles in the way than we think. And this does mean also, I think, that many of the arguments we make for our position should not be based on economic growth payoffs. So if you're arguing for lower taxes, for example, I don't think you should argue we should cut taxes because they will yield higher growth. Because if then the higher growth doesn't manifest, you're sunk. What you should do is say, we should cut taxes because people should control the decisions about how the income they've earned is spent rather than this being done through the collective process. In other words, you should frame arguments in terms of ethical individualism versus ethical collectivism and downplay, although this is important, the arguments about the secondary economic effects.
Thank you, Steve. On that point about the American state being basically a healthcare company with a military attached, I saw somebody, the Twitter commentator, saying Britain is, well, he said there are 6 letters that pretty much sum up Britain: NHS, BBC. And I said, so what you're saying is Britain is basically a health service with a TV station attached. Yeah. Julia.
Yeah, we don't have the military. At least the Americans have got that, but, otherwise, Paul Krugman is correct on that,
Well, thank you. My chapter of the book is called Classical Liberal Solutions to the Productivity Puzzle. And actually, Steve has covered some of these issues pretty well already. For those of you who don't know, the productivity puzzle is the marked slowdown in the growth of productivity since the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And that's seen pretty much across the Western world, and in fact in most advanced economies, with the notable exception of the US, which is really interesting. What is it the US is doing right that the rest of us are doing wrong? Why does productivity matter? Well, lots of well-known reasons. I mean, first of all, if you think of it in terms of real wages, then if productivity isn't growing, real wages tend to stagnate. That's obviously bad for workers. But also, if you get more gains in productivity, then it's possible for people to work fewer hours for the same pay. So it's good in terms of boosting leisure and welfare. Productivity growth, potentially good for the planet as well. If you're worried about growth driven by resource depletion, then if you grow things by productivity instead, you can typically do more with less. And then the final increasingly important point, of course, why productivity is important is what it means for debt sustainability. So yesterday, the Office for Budget Responsibility published their annual warning to the government that they've been publishing it for years since 2010 about the debt now being on an unsustainable path. They warned that on current policies, the debt to GDP ratio, so debt relative to national income, would increase from about 100% now to 270% within 50 years. But that was based on a relatively optimistic assumption that productivity grows by 1.5% a year, which we've not achieved for a considerable period of time. If instead productivity grows at the current rate, which is about 0.5% a year over that period, debt will explode to 649% of GDP on current policies. So in a sense, if you forget about a few billion here or there on the welfare bill, we can't get productivity up, then debt is simply going to explode, highly vulnerable to any form of future economic shock. And frankly, we'll be spending all our time working to pay the interest on that debt. So potential explanations for that productivity slowdown, I divide into sort of 3 groups. There's one group of thinkers who think this is what's sometimes known as secular stagnation. So the idea there's some sort of structural long-term shift in the economy that means we're doomed to grow a lot more slowly for a long period of time. The relatively pessimistic view, that was popularized most recently by an American economist called Robert Gordon. And he in particular focused on the idea that we've exhausted all the opportunities from the IT revolution. So hopefully he's wrong there because a new IT revolution has come along in form of AI. But he also picked up on a number of other points that aren't going to change rapidly, if at all, anytime soon. Things like demographics, the unwinding of the benefits of globalization and so on. Other people there chuck in things like the growth of inequality, though the evidence for that is pretty thin. So there's one relatively pessimistic group of explanations around this being a permanent structural shift of some type. The second set of explanations is that it's more sort of cyclical legacy of the global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis led to a long period of very low interest rates across the Western world and in Japan in particular. Japan is a good example of this because they had zero interest rates well before most countries in the West did. And that resulted in a prolonged period of weak productivity, not least because lots of firms that would normally go bankrupt, so-called zombie firms, didn't do so because they were being bailed out by cheap interest rates, cheap capital. Also, there's a period when labour was relatively cheap. We sort of discouraged companies from investing in expensive and risky machine and equipment because they could just employ more people. And arguably that was a particularly big problem in countries like the UK, where there was large-scale migration of relatively cheap labour from the European Union. So there's sort of two conventional explanations for the productivity slowdown. The third explanation, though, the one that I'd like to lead on, is simply that it's the government's fault, or a combination of the government and the electorate for voting in politicians who consistently believe that a big state is the solution to any of the country's problems. So obviously, since 2008, we've seen a big increase in both the size and the degree of intervention that the state is engaged in, particularly in the UK. So the huge explosion in government debt and related cost of financing that in terms of crowding out private investment and higher taxes. We've also seen big increases in regulation, particularly by the way of some of the sectors that had been, at least on paper, the most productive before the global financial crisis. So in the UK, financial services and the energy sector have been hit hard by higher taxes and more regulation. So what are the potential solutions to this? Well, I mean, first of all, I think you need to look at some individual problems that have hit some countries harder than others. I mean, I touched on energy costs. Big increase in energy costs in the UK, particularly in the last few years. We argue about exactly why, whether that's due to net zero or other factors. But we've been hit particularly hard with higher energy prices, as has, of course, Germany. And our economic performance of both those countries has been poor. I would also identify mass migration as a potential concern here. Difficult and controversial area, but it's worth noting that another country that has seen a particularly rapid slowdown in GDP per capita since the last 5 to 10 years or so has been Canada, which has always also seen very large-scale mass immigration as well. The public sector, I talked about the productivity puzzle overall. At least productivity in the private sector has continued to grow over this period, albeit relatively slowly. Productivity in the public sector has essentially been flat, and actually going back a lot further, back to about 1997, which is when the first consistent data on public sector productivity became available. Now, that's partly an unfair comparison because a lot of public sector activity, of course, is things like face-to-face services. It's not things like manufacturing, where it's easier to boost productivity. But it's not impossible, and there are lots of ways that we could make the NHS more productive, for example. And I think that basically involves addressing three problems. One is the lack of competition and market pressures. The second is dealing with very strong trade unions that are resisting change. And the third thing is looking at the funding model for the NHS, which is clearly failing to deliver productivity gains. So in terms of the big picture, what are the solutions? I think three really big things. First of all, we need a smaller, more efficient state. So I would go back to the old sort of classical liberal idea of the state doing the bare minimum, but doing those things a lot better. I heard on the radio this morning, for example, that some court cases are now being scheduled for 2029 because the government has underinvested in the criminal justice system, which is a perfect example of a public good where the state should be involved. So state needs to be doing some things a lot better than it is. Defence is arguably another example of that. But the state is doing loads of things that actually the private sector could participate more in or take the lead on. So a smaller, more efficient state. The second thing is relentless focus on not so much growth as such, but productivity. And productivity will tend to drive growth as well. So we need to get productivity up in both the public and the private sector. But the third thing is we need to address this, we might call it an information problem, all sorts of taboo subjects that we're not allowed to discuss like NHS reform or the pensions triple lock or net zero. I think we need to be willing to have braver conversations about that. As it is, plenty of people seem to be happy with government by YouGov poll. So the Amnesty International yesterday came in and supported a wealth tax on the basis of a YouGov poll that suggested 75% of people were in favour of it. I've gone back, by the way, to Amnesty International and pointed out that 60% of people in a recent YouGov poll backed the death penalty. But I have to heard back. Wait for their
We're not inconsistent. Should
Yeah.
follow yours.
That's it for me. Thank you. Thank you, Julian. So everything about slagging off the NHS is certainly music to my ears. Sorry. Cento, over to you.
Yes. My chapter in the book had nothing to do with economic growth. It was entitled Liberalism in the Regulatory State. And what I was concerned and particularly increasingly concerned about is liberalism is fading away. Yet it gets blamed for everything. That neoliberalism has caused all the problems that we have. And so what I did in that chapter was to go back to Hayek, which I seem to have some obsession with at the moment, and read what he had to say about what is essentially drawing the line between the market and the state. And I just want to quote a review of Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. And perhaps some of you, or perhaps no one will guess who wrote it, but the quotation is, in my opinion, this is a grand book. So he's reviewing The Road to Serfdom. Morally and philosophically, I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it, and not only in agreement with it, but in deeply moved agreement. But I come to what really is a very serious criticism of the book. You admit here and there that it is a question of knowing where to draw the line between the state and the market, or planning in that case, and the market. You agree that a line has to be drawn somewhere, that the logical extreme is not possible, but you give us no guidance whatsoever as to where we draw the line. It is true that you have, and I would probably draw it in different places. And then it goes on, as soon as you admit that the extreme is not possible, then you have to draw the line somewhere, and by an argument, you'll have to persuade people to move away from a planning direction. And I therefore conclude, it says your theme rather differently. I should say that what we want is not planning, or even less planning. I cut out the bit about I want more planning, but that planning should take place in community in which as many people as possible, both leaders and followers, wholly share your own moral position. Moderate planning will be safe if those carrying it out are rightly orientated in their own minds and hearts on the moral issue. Anyone guess who said that? Oh, well, all very well read people. Okay, so I would suggest that after The Road to Serfdom, the rest of Hayek's life was devoted to trying to find where to draw that line. And in his Mont Pelerin inaugural speech, he said, unless we can provide some guidance about what are legitimate or necessary government activities, and what are its limits, we must not complain if our views are not taken seriously when we oppose other kinds of less justified planning. So I perceive the problem at the moment, apart from the cycle going against liberalism or any type of philosophy, and just opportunism and the political expediency, is that liberals in particular have to reinvent themselves in some way or another. And so what did Hayek say? Can we get any guidance from Hayek? So let me just canter through what Hayek said. I think it's been said here that the issue is one of knowledge. Can government do a better job than the market? And the foundation of Hayek's theory of markets and the economy and the legal system was basically this knowledge problem. That he defined knowledge as localized understanding of a particular circumstances in time and place, only known to each individual, dispersed amongst individuals. And the market was seen as perhaps all of you know here, as a discovery procedure where prices were a sort of telecommunication signaling system that dealt with the knowledge problem because the interaction of a dispersed number of people fed into the pricing mechanism, and people could rely on prices in a competitive market to signal what the value of those resources consumed in the production of those goods and match them with what they were willing to pay. So there's no big insight. Well, there's a big insight there because no one really uses that approach to the market. Now what is less appreciated is that Hayek's case for the market, liberalism and economic freedom is not based on some ethical presuppositions such as freedom, was actually based on irremediable ignorance. He said the awareness of our irremediable ignorance is the most of what is known to somebody is ignorance of most of what is known to somebody is the chief basis of the argument for liberty. This is especially true in the economic field. If it appears that the market mechanism leads to an effective utilization of more knowledge than any other directing agency can possess, this is the chief foundation of the case for economic freedom. And then he goes on in 1960 in his Constitution of Liberty saying, but if men were omniscient, there would be little case for liberty. So quite extreme statements of a man who's associated with sort of liberty and freedom. So, obviously, people pick out bits and pieces from Hayek, and he's seen as a sort of laissez-faire liberal, and saying that the market will solve everything. But that is in fact not what he did. He was trained as a lawyer, so he knew that a market system is based on legal foundations, law of contract, private property. He spent a lot of time looking at the different legal systems. He made a distinction between grown law and made law, that is, in English terms, the common law and legislation. And he revitalized the concept of the rule of law in intellectual thinking. And the rule of law played a prominent part in his whole schema. He described it as a meta-legal doctrine or a political ideal. And he defined it as stripped of all technicalities. This means the government in all its actions is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand, rules which make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and to plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. So it's the rule of law rather than the rule of men, and he saw that as the linchpin of his view of government, view of the legal system. But again, in typical Hayek fashion, he backs off from that and says the rule of law, though necessary, is not sufficient for the satisfactory working of a free economy. And he introduced two constraining principles as far as, from my reading, expediency and community interest. What do these mean? Well, let's deal with expediency. Unconvincing. It was basically that regulations should be subject to cost-benefit analysis. And expediency is a test whether discretionary actions are efficient in reaching their objectives, and economic analysis, especially the weighing of costs and benefits, is crucial to making those judgments. Anyone who's been a student of government regulation has known that cost-benefit analysis does not constrain regulation. I remember when Mark Illerwood joined the IEA, he went on the panel, the government panel of regulatory, whatever it was called, in which they cost-benefited everything. And I think I said, "You're wasting your time, mate." And I think he realized that after a while. It just becomes a box-ticking exercise. Community interest. Now, this is very interesting because it goes back to this, what Keynes said about sharing moral values. Hayek said the ultimate standard is neither the rule of law nor expediency, backing off again, but community interest. In a free society in which power rests on opinion, this ultimate power will be the power which deters nothing directly yet controls all positive power by tolerating only certain kinds of exercise of that power. This opinion is seen to come from society's common cultural view of what is right and wrong. This posits an uncomfortable position that the case for and the acceptability of liberalism relies on liberal beliefs being widely held.
That is not where we are today.
No. And I'll finish off with another sort of slight backing off from Hayek's core position. What Hayek offers in trying to draw the line between the state and the market, is essentially a utilitarian view of the state. We've seen he's once used cost-benefit analysis, and he was probably influenced by his time in the United States, where that became slightly voguish in the 70s, or prior to the 70s. But if you read Hayek's even The Road to Serfdom, but some of his subsequent things, he had a very broad view of what the state should do. I mean, it should be involved in health and safety, building regulations, certification of professions, restrictions on the sale of certain arms, explosives and poisons and drugs, regulation of the process of production, and the provision of such public institutions as theatres, sports grounds, setting weights and measures, surveying, registration statistics. He recognised that the state would have far-reaching discretionary powers, which should be subjected to judicial review and cost-benefit analysis. Good luck. The state should deal, obviously, with national security, internal insurrection, natural disasters, floods, storms, earthquakes, epidemics, and was controversially supportive of compulsory national military conscription. So what I draw out of this, because obviously Hayek is a much smarter person than I am and a greater thinker and has spent decades, is that if we are to redress the balance of the growth of the state, we have to develop or reinvent liberalism, as Hayek did after the Second World War, when he moved away from laissez-faire liberalism to what I would call competitive liberalism, where he was supporting the competitive market. Now we're in a totally different situation. I don't have the answers, but what I do know is that we must move away from arguments about efficiency to a more moral basis for arguing for a reduction in the role of the state and trying to get that through. And I believe that was ultimately why this institute was set up, was the battle of ideas. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Cento. You should write something for our blog on how Hayek was actually totally unsound and a massive wet. Before I open to the floor...
I've got mice already.
Go for it. I'll start with one question for each panelist before I open to the floor. Steve, you said that the issue of economic growth has become central again. Doesn't this contradict the theme of your book about the realignment? I know that's been one of your main themes in recent years, that nowadays political divides are not so much defined by economics. Are you a big state or a small state kind of guy? It's more about matters of culture and identity. Are you more of a nationalist or are you more of a cosmopolitan? And that is how we build political camps today, and that economics is almost a second fiddle to that. Are we seeing a re-emergence of economics as a primary axis, or is there a contradiction there?
No, I don't think there is. I don't think we're seeing, despite what I just said about how all of the politicians at the moment are, claiming that they favour economic growth and they're trying to achieve it. I think as far as the voters are concerned, the big divisions are still about, as I have argued, identity, cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, basically. However, all of the voters, regardless of whether they're cosmopolitan or nationalist, they still want public spending, but with no taxes on that. And the politicians who are increasingly tailoring their pitches to this divide between globalist cosmopolitanism and nationalism are then trying to show that, you'll get what you want in terms of, immigration, for example, if you're on the nationalist side of that divide. But it's not going to mean that you have less of a pension, hence the trade-off that I mentioned. Now, I think, though, that increasingly we're going to move to a situation where two things will happen. One is that many people will say, well, okay, if getting what I really want from this other issue means less growth, then yeah, I'll take that. I think that is the position we're going to move to. Right now, they don't want to say that because they fear that they'll lose elections if they do it. But I think increasingly people will actually come up with that and say that. And you can see this. Nigel Farage has said things to that in that vein before. In the United States, you are now getting people who are saying, well, Donald Trump tariffs may be bad for the American consumer. It may not be good for growth in the American economy, but it's giving us our independence back. Apparently, and so, which is okay, and I'll take that. So that's the one thing that will happen. I think the other thing that's going to happen is that I suspect we are going to see economic arguments for economics continue to decline as really divisive, if you like, fundamental ones. I think most people, in terms of economic policy, the policy they think the government should follow, are going to center on a kind of Chinese-style neo-mercantilism. And the true socialists and the true free marketeers are going to be two fairly small minority groups. Most people are going to think that the kind of Chinese model of a broadly private economy, but with a very active government, is the way to go. And there will then be arguments at the margin about whether or not this or that particular government or policy is working. But within that framework, I think it'll be mainly about, as I've argued many times, these new issues of globalism versus nationalism. Now, what that also means, I think, is if you're a liberal, you can't frame your arguments purely in terms of economic efficiency, as Cento said, any more than a nationalist can. You have to talk about things like individual rights, personal autonomy, personal moral development, human flourishing, the kind of John Stuart Mill arguments. You can't frame everything in terms of economic efficiency anymore.
Okay, so the good news is the full-on socialists are going to become marginal. The bad news is we liberals are going to become just as marginal.
Well, economics like economic liberals, it was like different reasons.
Julian, on this secular stagnation thesis, I know it's not your thesis, you're just summarizing it, but from that perspective, the people who make that case, how would they account for the fact that everybody seems to be stagnating at different levels? Isn't the idea that you hit a barrier somewhere and that is the efficiency frontier and then there's nowhere else to go? So even if there was some truth in it, if say the GDP per capita of Switzerland today, if that were the absolute maximum, well, for Britain this would still mean we would be, if we reach that level, we would be about 1.5 times as rich as we are today. So how does that?
Well, I've got a number of problems with the secular stagnation hypothesis. One is it seems to be a catch-all for loads of different ideas that are not necessarily consistent. So any explanation that might fit a narrative gets lumped in there. But you're absolutely right to pick up on the point that it seems odd that seemed to have affected all countries similarly. And at the same time, as well, it also kicked in 2007, 2008, pretty much globally with the main exception of the US, which leads me to think that those cyclical factors, the legacy of the global financial crisis, was actually at least as important as any of those longer-term structural changes. It just seems too much of a coincidence. It's kicked in everywhere. If that is the case, then you can lead to a relatively optimistic story because, cyclical things tend to come to an end eventually. And of course, it has been an unusually long cycle if that is the case. But you could argue that we had the shock of the global financial crisis and then a series of other shocks that have come along and replicated the problem. So if we take Europe, of course, there's global financial crisis, then the European debt crisis on top of that. If we take the UK, we had the shock of Brexit, the initial uncertainty that created. We then had the global shock of COVID and more recently the energy crisis. So there do seem to be an unlucky period of shocks that have probably meant that cyclical problems have lasted longer than they would otherwise have done. But whether you look at it in sort of cyclical terms or structural terms, I think the common feature of those countries that have tended to do worst is big government. And I still think that's fundamentally the problem. The increase in the size of the state, the amount of intervention. And again, sorry to come back to the point of blaming the public partly for this as well, a perception that the solution to any problem is more government of one type or another. I think COVID was obviously awful for all sorts of reasons, health and social reasons and so on. But it also did seem to reinforce this idea that the government is there to bail you out under any circumstances. And I just dread turning on the radio every morning a new form of government intervention. And they're now going to bugger up English football, for example. It's only one of a latest series of examples. And it's not just this government. Late stage Sunakism is arguably just as bad, if not worse. So there is this perception that the solution to everything is more government, whereas I actually think more government is typically a key part of the problem.
Thank you. Cento, you've mentioned this contrast that on the one hand, liberals seem to be losing influence. So we're the baddies. Nobody is listening to us. At the same time, we get the blame for everything. That doesn't seem to go together. That's certainly the experience if you work for a liberal think tank, that people tell you, oh, you guys are actually in charge. You run the country. And I always wonder, well, do we? And I think the country would look differently if we do. But isn't the problem here that the problem of the last 15 years or so is that there is no obvious way to summarize the political economic trend of that period. So if you look at earlier times, so I learned about British post-war history for the first time at school. I remember this in the late 90s. And the teacher at the time said, well, it's very simple. You can subdivide it into 3 distinct periods. Post-war consensus, 1945 to 1979. Neoliberalism, or then they called it something else, 1979 to 97. And then third wave, Blairism, which had just started, market-friendly social democracy. You get these 3 chapters. And I know not everybody believes that. Sometimes it's oversimplification and all that. But you still had these obvious labels that you could attach to particular periods. How would you even, what label, how would you even describe the last 15 years? So since Cameron, what the hell happened there? What would be a good way to summarize?
I don't know. But yes, in even educated people will say, it's all the problem of the free market, which is, they should halt then and realize that the contradiction that they're making. And neoliberalism. I mean, I did the review for Economic Affairs of Stiglitz's book, A Road to Freedom. Yeah. And he said it's all Hayek's fault. And there are tons of academic books that have come out and saying it's all these neoliberals, and for some reason, particularly Hayek, are responsible for all this. And Stiglitz, who's an intelligent individual, but he says Hayek is the road to fascism. So you've got, I think, apart from the lack of concrete definition of who is a liberal, because obviously in the United States it means something different, and you have liberals who are sort of social democrats, and you've got liberals who are classical liberals. So I think liberalism itself suffers from an identity crisis because no one can actually define what it is. And I quoted Keynes, Beveridge, I didn't quote him, but Beveridge and Hayek, all liberals. They would classify themselves as liberals during that period. And they all had very different approaches. So obviously, Beveridge led to the welfare state. Keynes was a great buddy of Hayek in the end, but, they had different views about economics and macroeconomics. So I don't know what the solution is. And it needs someone to step back and give quite a concrete definition and set of policies that are understood by the electorate, principally. I don't know how that's going to be done, because the IEA, did have a success, but every success leads to diminishing returns, and then the forces of evil take over.
Yeah, but at least, so if the forces of evil at least had an obvious label, then we could say, okay, this is the ruling ideology of now or the last couple of years, and therefore we're against it. But I think what happens is simply since this has been such a confused period, the last 15 years, there's no obvious label. People just lazily assume, oh, well, it's somehow just an extension of neoliberalism. So this was the last time we had a clear orientation. This is what was going on. And since then, it's been a bit fussy. So you just assume, well, everything since then is probably somehow also neoliberalism. Right? And that's it. Do we have questions? Yes, over here. We have a microphone going around. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, Tom Burrows. I just wanted to put a question about one particular force that's been at work at least since 2007-8. Which is, and it only relatively recently came to an end, which was, we had a period when money was basically free.
Yeah.
A very good book I recommend to anyone who hasn't read it by Edward Chancellor, called The Price of Time, which is one of the best books on economics from a fairly popular point of view that I've read for a long time.
No.
And he makes this point, which I think Stephen and Julian in particular have touched on, which is the zombification effect. Companies increasingly get interested in financial engineering rather than actually investing profits and stuff that's going to actually produce things for the future or services for the future. So the question is, just how part does this period of about 12, 13 years had in basically squeezing so much productivity out of the incentive to engage in it? Because it seems to me that this is, even now you hear people like Donald Trump or even slightly less crazy people going on about interest rate cuts, is that they're self-evidently a good thing. And when I point out actually higher rates are a good thing, people give me a dirty look. But it seems to me that this addiction to cheap money is a huge part of the problem.
Indeed.
Yeah. So do we live in a zombie economy?
Yeah, yes, we do. The only way I would disagree with what Tom Burrows just said is that I don't think it goes back just to 2007, 2008, around then, and the introduction of QE. I would date it actually back to 1997. That was the point at which central banks, notably the Fed, following the lead set by the Bank of Japan, actually, but also subsequently other central banks, followed a policy of whenever there was any sign of an economic slowdown, however mild and however needed, they cut interest rates.
Yeah.
So from 1997, following the East Asian financial crisis of that year onwards, we had a steady downward trend in interest rates. And if you follow the Fiscal loanable funds model of what determines interest rates, the natural rate of interest, it's very clear that by as early as 2000, 2001, the rate of interest being charged by the central banks is well below the natural rate of interest. And we've had a secular trend, to use that term that you like, in term, downwards ever since, which is then really put on steroids after the financial crisis. Why do they do that? Well, because this cheap money has all kinds of highly distortive effects, not just zombification. It also leads to major mispricing of assets. Because increasingly the value of assets is their net present value is not determined, as the textbooks tell you it should be, by the income stream that the asset will generate if used productively over the next 10 years, say, subject to a discount. It's determined by, given that income stream, how much can you borrow against it? And so essentially the value of an asset like a building, say, or a company or a factory comes to be not what is the value of the product you will make, but how much money can you borrow against that income stream. And the result is you have enormously inflated values in assets of all classes of assets, basically. And in 2008, that whole show came off the rails, basically. And my take on QE is that it was designed essentially to avoid a major asset price correction. For actually, in some way, I can understand why they did this, but that was the governments around the world were, they wanted to avoid that at almost any cost. So we had QE, and which we're now still getting. And what is also worth saying is that kind of easy money, and QE in particular, has very pronounced Cantillon effects. That is, it creates big benefits for the people who have initial access to it. And it's one of the major reasons why you've had big growth in wealth inequality since 2007, because the people who get first dibs on the new money created by QE are the wealthy and people with access to finance, disproportionate easy access to finance, which typically means the rich, plus the financial services sector. And so I think that it's an enormous central feature of where we are, the progressive derangement of the global monetary system.
Could I just add one point to that as well? It also has buggered up fiscal policy because governments felt that they could spend and borrow and spend as much as they liked at near zero interest rates. So that encouraged a lot of complacency. Wow. It led to a lot of policy mistakes as well. I mean, with hindsight, would it be much better, of course, to lock in some of those long interest rates, whereas actually the effect of QE has been to significantly shorten the maturity of government debt, because a lot of that borrowing is now financed at the Bank of England's base rate. So we basically buggered up fiscal policy for a generation. That's one of the reasons why debt is so high. And of course, now interest rates are returning back towards more normal and sensible levels. I think 4.5% is probably perfectly reasonable as a neutral level for the interest rate. That is far higher than governments had been expecting and was priced in even to the markets.
Yeah.
So that long period of low interest rates has created enormous complacency about the public finances. And now, of course, the chicken's coming home to roost, and the UK in particular has consistently had the highest borrowing costs in the G7 group of major economies for at least the last year or two.
Okay, so Steve's point was pessimistic enough. You managed to depress us even further. Question from Sheldon here.
Sheldon Wilkie, do you think it was right to give the Bank of England or make it independent in 1997?
You answer that personally?
Yes. I mean, I'm not a fan of big government, so I certainly don't think politicians should be setting interest rates. Of course, the Bank of England is not really fully independent. It has operational independence over interest rates, but its inflation target is still set by the government. By and large, when it wants to do QE, it does that in cooperation with the government, which I'm very concerned about because that blurs the distinction between fiscal and monetary policy. And if we look at the people who have been running the Bank of England since independence, there are some very, very good people who have been on the Monetary Policy Committee. The large majority of them, though, I would say are not good. And a lot of them, I would say, are too close to the Treasury. I mean, it's hard to find experienced economists haven't worked at the Treasury at some point, but the links between the Treasury and the Bank of England, I personally think, are too strong. And we've also had one governor in particular. I was delighted he was elected to a senior position in another country, and we're finally able to get rid of him. But I won't name him. But he was particularly responsible, I think, for the mission creep at the Bank of England and the adoption of QE and loads of secondary objectives like climate change and so on. They lost sight of their fundamental job, which is to control inflation and the value of money.
Yeah. Can I quickly say that I take a much more radical view? My view is that we shouldn't have a central bank. And that we should allow the operations of the banking system, a free banking system, the money market, to determine interest rates. I used to favour an independent central bank, but I actually think what Julian's just said shows that really that's a waste of time because it's inevitably a political decision. It's just a political decision which, instead of being democratically accountable, is obfuscated and carried on behind the screen of a nominally independent central bank.
Very sound. Who else? Question here in the front.
Thank you.
Microphone's coming.
Joshua Bowden, and I'm a MA student at the University of Buckingham. My question is, if you go back to the 1970s, and Kristian alluded to this in the introduction, you could say we face sort of similar problems to today. But back then, the problem was the public sector in the form of companies that were quite obviously nationalised. That was sort of playing for everybody to see. These days, the problem is really in the form of a kind of shadow public sector. For instance, people in, say, HR departments whose job mainly entails fulfilling government policy, as well as sort of various duties, particularly in the form of name of a person's law, where something unfortunate and obviously very sad is happening to somebody. There is a law named after them, but this law is poorly thought out and causes various problems. Is our big problem that we have this shadow public economy that is very difficult to define. Often when it is defined, it often maybe strays into some quite controversial areas that mean that having a discussion on it is quite difficult from a kind of semantic point of view.
Okay, so do we have a zombie sector within our zombie economy?
I would agree with that. I think we seem to develop sort of like bureaucratic states operating alongside the elected state. And there are lots of examples I could give of that. One obvious one is equal pay legislation that, probably 30, 40 years ago, it made sense because there was clearly rampant discrimination in the workplace. And it was very hard for women to do what were considered to be men's jobs. Now it's very different. If you work for a department store, you, as a woman, you have a pretty free choice as whether you're going to work on the checkout or in the warehouse. And yet people who are not economists and clearly have no grasp of economics, I'm afraid they tend to be lawyers or HR professionals or whoever it might be.
I don't know where you're pointing at me.
Sorry about that.
I'm an economist.
Yeah, I have an interest in law anyway. I have a diploma in law, so I'll group myself in this category as well. They seem to think that the market shouldn't be allowed to decide pay rates anymore. That should be decided by a committee or lawyers or judges or whoever else it might be. So a law that was introduced with the best intentions has become a monster that is distorting the markets. And of course, there's a massive bureaucracy, a sort of dead weight of people, frankly, doing these jobs.
Yeah,
could
exactly.
be doing almost anything more useful.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, the point is that there's a huge number of what the late David Graeber very aptly called bullshit jobs, basically, where the people who are doing them know, this was all the nature of his research project, that the job they're doing is completely useless and doesn't actually add anything. What are they? Well, they're basically exercising legal veto powers, because what you have is however, something which raises the kind of point Cento was talking about Hayek's project of the rule of law, because the rule of law could be described as subjecting human life to the governance of rules. famous formulation by Lon Fuller. The problem with, I think what we've seen is now in Britain and many other countries is how that can actually be problematic when you start to think it through in detail and think if you subject everything in life to explicit rules rather than norms, understandings, mores, things of that sort, what you find is that because of the knowledge problem, the rules have to be unbelievably complicated to try and cover every contingency, and they don't. And what you also do is they create lots and lots of veto holders. People in every kind of sector, the public sector, the private sector, you cannot increasingly do anything without ticking a whole series of boxes. And there are people all over the place whose only job is to extract a rent for providing the approval that you can do this or that. The American archduke, John Michael Greer, has coined a wonderful phrase for this system of governance. He calls it linocracy, which means the rule of pimps, on the basis that a pimp does not actually offer you the service that you're paying for. He is simply the gatekeeper who charges a fee for giving you access to the service. And he says basically the big problem with the modern economy is that it is overrun with lenocrats, basically.
License and yeah. But I think we shouldn't misinterpret Hayek too much because it was abstract general rules of non-discrimination. I think that the greater danger with the regulatory state, if you want to call it that, is not even so much legislation, but is this subterranean guidance notes,
Precisely.
Administrative regulations. And you can see that in the tax system. You don't know whether you're liable to tax sometimes or not liable to tax when you read their guidance notes. And then they impose tax on you and they say, well, go to the tax tribunal and fight it out. But you'll pay the tax in the interim. And who wants to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, not much time left for the formal part. Let's collect 3 questions at once. Here at the back.
Oh, yeah, thank you. My sensibilities are more libertarian, perhaps, than most of you, in terms of minimizing the state and rolling back. And I feel what my question is, I can identify some figures like this in this nationalist camp, let's say in reform. Somebody like Rupert Lowe says he's an Austrian. His favorite book is Atlas Shrugged. You have the AfD in Germany. You have a quite market liberal positions. Even Nigel Farage, I would say, if you think about Elon Musk, Doge, and all that, I think it's quite exciting. And there's a wondering where you positioning yourself politically in terms of Vice, how will you deal with reform? Is that something you want to, or this new outfit of Rupert Lowe? Is that something you're interested in? And I was just on the question, sometimes it's just good to put out positions like, for instance, Markus Karl in Germany saying, positions like abolish income tax. We can go there. Look at Singapore, a first world country, can run down the tax base. So I just feel that some of the positioning here is very mild and timid, and I like actually Stephen's thing, abolish the central bank, to put something like this out there just to see maybe that then there's a chance to be somewhere in between.
Okay, so libertarianism in one country, basically. Let's collect 2 more questions. Yes, here in front.
Should be over to Linda.
I'm not the one at the front, but never mind.
Grab a boy.
My name's Paul Chase. I've come down here from Merseyside today to attend this. An interesting difference between what Stephen is saying about he actually wants a more radical solution to abolish the central bank, but perhaps a less radical step might be to re-examine its remit and have it concentrate solely on controlling the quantity of money and leave the market to determine the level of interest rates. That was seen to me to be a way that would, in a sense, automatically help to rein in excessive government spending. Or in the alternative, if things have gone too far for that kind of tinkering, does the panel think that the only way we're going to get a rational set of public finances in the future is for there to be a complete collapse of the fiat money system?
So accelerationism.
One of the right front, maybe.
I know who was first. It's a bit like
at the pub where I was trying to.
Well, I'll trust your judgment.
Thanks. I like IEA events because they very interesting, but they also increase my intellectual vocabulary. Because Kristian started that with his description at the start of about 5 or 6 minutes, very eloquently. I just thought he said the country was going on the pan, and but we put it so much better than that. Stephen educated me further, in fact, by talking about the economically inactive, because I just thought they were dolly buns. But thank you for that. Like Maggie Thatcher's economic with the truth when she means lying. Picking up though seriously on Julian's points about the country going bust. I mean, I saw in the Guardian online today. I don't carry it. I'm not a Guardian reader, but I saw online in the Guardian today that talking about justice system. You said they were putting trials back to 2029. They think they're doing away with jury trials to make it more efficient. And pensions. There was talk about the DWP going bust in 20 years or something it was. I mean, if that's not going on the pan, what is? I mean, on the net zero subject, I mean, I just can't work out how this country or people in it think that we are being net zero by not digging our own coal and shipping it from Japan. Don't we need a UK Doge? Any comments?
Well, I mean, the conclusion that we're going to hell in a handcart, that's always my conclusion. I just get there in different ways depending on what the topic of the day is. So we had 3 points there. Coalition with populists, libertarian populist coalition, is that a possibility? Quantity theory of money, quite literally interpreted, would that be a less radical alternative? Or does fiat money have to go completely? And what, are we going bust?
Shall I give very brief answers to each three? Okay. But first of all, on the politics question, I posted something on this on Twitter a week or so ago that I think I should develop into a piece. I was quite struck by...
Send it to me.
Oh, I will do, yeah. A New Statesman headline cover basically said, just raise tax. And in a sense, I wish the Labour Party would explicitly adopt that as their position. So we have a Labour Party that explicitly says we are the party of the big state and public services. We'll spend more and we will tax more. And then balance that with other parties who are saying different things. So a Conservative Party that is a small, efficient state party believing in individual freedoms on top of that. This is what I would like, not what I'm saying it is. The Lib Dems could become a single issue, rejoin the EU party. We could have some hard left parties, maybe around the Greens or Corbyn or whoever, which would essentially be an anti-growth, anti-West coalition. But I suspect that would be quite popular. And then we have a party like Reform that would be essentially very much a populist party that would suggest anything that might win votes. And actually, Reform has come up with some quite interesting ideas that nobody else is really thinking about. So raising the personal allowance to £20,000, reducing the amount of interest the Bank of England pays on reserves. There are good icons for all of those ideas, but they, unfortunately, are the only bold ideas and they're not part of a coherent platform. But I would love to see more distinction between the parties going into the next manifesto. The second point about monetary policy, I think we do need to move away from thinking just about interest rates. I'm not as a purist monetarist on this, so I think we should continue to think about interest rates, but also the growth of the money supply. And of course, the Bank of England gives next to no attention to the growth of money supply, which is one reason why the bank, amongst many others, missed the explosion of inflation in the wake of COVID, because they're looking at individual prices and ignoring the fact that sterling M3 was growing at double-digit rates for a long period of time. So we need more attention on the money supply. The third point, Britain's not going to go bust in the sense that most people understand, because of course we are a sovereign nation issuing our own currency. We can always print more money, but that's the magic money tree argument. So the problem with that is that, okay, it may not go bust, but you end up doing lots of things. One is you create enormous amounts of inflation because you're printing money, you're creating fiat currency when there isn't the real resources to justify that. And of course, you're then distorting the economy because all the money is in the hands of the government or directed by it. So we won't go bust in that sense, but the economy will be significantly worse off, and we all will, because inflation's much higher than it would otherwise have been.
So we won't go literally bust, we will just become the Weimar Republic, including with lots of different parties that all hate each other. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do the same thing, and Julian, quite quickly, in reverse order. Taking the third question first. In one sense, a sovereign country can't go bust because the resources, the people, the buildings, the land, the other resources are still there. However, governments can go bust. The political apparatus of the state can go bust, and this happens constantly in history. Philip II of Spain went bankrupt 4 times during his reign because he wouldn't go fighting the Dutch. I have to say, looking at the state of not just the British public finances, but the public finances of a number of countries, notably the US, the current situation here reminds me a lot of France in 1787, 1788. With the hapless Rachel Reeves as the equivalent of Monsieur de Calonne, the last finance minister of Louis XVI. I don't know what our equivalent of calling the Estates General
You're making
is.
us sound too good.
But the point is that governments can go bankrupt. They have to either radically reschedule their debts or even default on the debts. They have to suddenly find that they just haven't got the money they need and they just stop doing a whole range of things. So that's very possible. I think at the moment that's the direction we're going in. Because the report I alluded to said that in order to meet the demands of the health service plus pensions and keep the rest of the state the way it is, we would have to have government spending 60 to 70% of GDP, which is the levels you saw during the 2 world wars. Now, that means, amongst other things, a 50% cut in private consumption. You can just about mobilize the British public to support that during the existential threat of a war. Can you do that otherwise? No, I don't think so. So we're heading for a really big smash up. In terms of money, the problem with having a central bank just controls money supply is that in not just the modern world, but any world really for a very long time, the bulk of money is credit created by the banking system. And it's extremely difficult, maybe even theoretically impossible for the central bank to control that directly because the only way it could do would be if it completely controlled and licensed the creation of credit, which would be a disaster. If you track a particular measure of money, you find that the people in business, the banking sector, the ordinary lay public, they soon realize that that's the measure the government is tracking, and it stops being a meaningful indicator of what is going on. So this idea that Milton Friedman had, that the central bank can simply grow the supply of money by a fixed amount each year, I think that's actually just not credible, really, which is why they pull away from it and turn to inflation targeting and interest rates instead. That's one of many reasons why I do hold the radical free banking position. So that sounds like a nice solution, but I just don't think it's feasible. On the last question, no, I do not think that liberals of any kind should have anything to do with the new populist politics. These people are the devil, basically. And, they're all like the tar baby. Do not touch them. Now, there are 2 things. One is you do have some people, like you mentioned Elon Musk, who advocate what Kristian aptly called libertarianism in one country, to adapt a well-known phrase. You might be able to get away with that in the United States or in a number of other very large countries, but India, for example, if they were to try it, which they're not. But it's not a feasible politics for a medium-sized country which is significantly exposed to world trade and world capital and trade flows like the United Kingdom is. In practice, politics of that kind, the populist parties, they often start off with that combination of radical free market views plus nationalism, but their general trajectory pretty much everywhere is to ditch the free market side and move in the direction of greater statism. You can see this in France with Marine Le Pen. You mentioned the AFD. I think the AFD has actually moved a long way in that direction. And there's a simple reason. What they discover is that if they want to get the nationalist things that they want, they've got to row back on the free markets. And in the United States, who knows what Donald Trump will decide next? Being in the White House is like being at the court of Henry VIII, I think, with Elon Musk presumably in the role of Thomas Cromwell, but not yet executed. But there's been a clear shift within the Trump coalition away from his views to the views of the kind of Steve Bannon's, Josh Hawley's of this world, the more economically nationalist Oren Cass wing of the MAGA coalition. Plus, I would say, by the way, Doge was a complete joke. It was not actually about reducing government spending. It was really about attacking the bureaucratic class. Now, that's a good thing, but it was not going to reduce government spending because something like 80% of all US government spending is interest on the debt, the Defense Department, and the big three: Social Security, which is pensions, of course, Medicare, and Medicaid. And until this recent big, beautiful bill, none of those have been touched. And in particular, Medicare, which is the one that is going to bankrupt the United States, is untouchable. And that's the big problem now.
So we're not just economically screwed, we don't even have potential coalition partners either. Cento, can you cheer us up on a final note? Tuck all that.
Yes, I think we should put out more radical ideas. Flat taxes, free banking.
Definitely.
We should go back to that core set of issues that, we did. The IEA has been traditionally associated with: controls of money supply, all those things which seem to, I think it strikes me that we're so fixated with what is actually happening
I agree
and
completely.
fighting at the margin all these changes. And we should be rowing back and saying, look, we need these fundamental reforms, because the things, this pessimistic, almost depressing, suicidal sort of mist that's coming over this whole slip has to be dispelled somehow.
Couldn't agree more. We have to end the final, the formal part here, but the bar is still open, or it is going to reopen this minute. So stay for a drink, and thank you to all our speakers.
Better.